Well, it's good to see Terry again. It's good to see all of you who are going to hopefully be able to be with us in our study today. We'll start with just a very simple thing. Terry, how are you doing as we kind of dig back into the work of preaching and the work of teaching this fine Tuesday morning?
I'm doing good. I'm doing pretty good. I think one of the things that's interesting is just with everything that's gone on. Certainly, I'm grateful to be inching our way back to normalcy on a lot of things from a congregational perspective. Here, we just last week had our first Wednesday night Bible study. Still outside in the parking lot, by the way. We're not inside. But it was another step towards normalcy for us that was very welcome, and thankful for that. And I think, like you, still see numbers causing me concern. I don't know where we're going in all of this, but I'm glad that we are able to move towards back to some of our more regular things, being with my brethren more publicly, and just some of those things. So I'm encouraged by all of that, certainly so.
Yeah, as I'm kind of living in a limbo land as to each day as it unfolds. We do have a higher level of interaction at the congregation at Eastside. I think that's a blessing and something to be encouraged by. And yet, I think I saw this pithy take on it a while back that some of us are done with COVID-19, but it's pretty practical to understand that it's not done with us and won't be for a while. Let me add a couple things structurally. Going forward, if you want to participate in the conversation, there's two avenues now as opposed to our normal one choice. You can always go on social media. bit.ly/live Bible studies will take you to the YouTube page, Facebook, all of that. But if you go to bit.ly/Zoom the work, you can join on the Zoom side if that's your preference. It'll give you an opportunity to interact with Terry and I in a more complete way. You can ask us questions. You can have the Q&A function, chat with the other participants, and do so with a little bit more anonymity because those discussions aren't put on the live feed. So
let's sell this a little clearer, okay? If you've ever wanted to be the two guys in the Muppet Show during our broadcast making snarky comments, you want to be on Zoom because you can do that. We'll ignore you on the social media side, and then you can get your digs in. So that was for you, Jared, Saltz, Mark, Russell, Shane Scott, and all the rest of you.
Right. And it's ironic because the two grumpy old guys are actually the ones that everybody sees. So there's a little levity.
I was that guy Sunday in yours and Shane Scott's broadcast. It was completely enjoyable to be that guy sitting up in the booth, I got to say.
Yeah. We appreciate you. We appreciate you. Keep us on our toes.
Yeah.
So Terry and I, and Terry actually is the genesis for the topic today. So Terry, why don't you introduce our topic for us, and we can kind of look through it through the eyes of an evangelist shortly.
Well, with everything going on right now, the thing that I think is getting overlooked, and by the way, from the outset, let me say, social media makes this all a lot worse. There's a lot of people that are hurt for a lot of different reasons. And one of the things I think that is more important that we're overlooking is the need for us to learn how to help people heal from their hurt. Sometimes what we're more interested in doing in times like these is defending whatever side we're on, or defending our political position about something, or defending whatever statements are being made by, posting some cute meme that says that's completely irrational and unjustifiable. And all that goes on social media quite a bit. And none of that is helpful in the overall scheme of things. Especially for preachers, part of the work of preaching is edification and encouragement, I believe, Phil. Part of our job is to build people up. And when I'm spending a large part of my time arguing about why this person is wrong and I'm right, or more targeted, let me say this, more targeted, looking at somebody who expresses their pain about something to do, for instance, with their race, and rather than acknowledging the pain and seeing it and trying to help them in that situation, I spend my time trying to explain to them how that's just not true. I'm not only am I failing to build them up and more importantly, help them heal from the pain they're feeling, I'm ignoring their pain, and I'm causing more pain in the process. And I think one of the things that and this isn't just about race. I think for a long time, and maybe I've just seen this more recently, for a long time I've noticed that when Christians hurt, it seems like we are far more ready to dismiss their pain than acknowledge their pain. And we're far more ready to try to say, I mean, truthfully, a lot of times what we do is say, sorry you feel that way, I'll be praying for you, now buck up and get over it. And sometimes what needs to happen is us to just embrace them. And I love the book of Job for a lot of reasons. But one of the things I love about Job was the friends show up and they don't say anything for 7 days. And in that time period, they were a comfort to Job just by being there. You know, we miss out on that, I think, sometimes. And we want to talk about
Job's a complex text. Job's friends start out well, they mean well, but they end up stabbing the core of his heart with their misguided advice. Once they open their mouth, everything goes downhill.
Woe unto me, for you are miserable comforters. Yeah. I mean, that's how Job felt about his friends after they started talking.
Right. And I think there's a New Testament text that answers my perspective that we need to grow into. Like Terry and I will sometimes say, we're not coming at this from the perspective of we're the experts and we've always done it the best way and we've made every great decision. In James chapter 1, verse 19, there is the statement, know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And I want to tie a couple of threads together to kind of open up some doors of dialogue. By the way, if you're joining on Facebook and all that stuff, drop your questions in the chat. We'll happy to address them and bring your beneficial insights into play. Here's some things to think about. Very often when hurt is the fuel that fires the conversation, you got to give it time to die off a little bit. But that's hard to do. That's one of the part about this text in James 1:19 of the progression here. That's difficult to do because when angry words are spoken in our vicinity direction and we ourselves are hurt or injured by that action, we have a choice to make. How do we respond? Do we respond with hurt from hurt? Or do we be quick to hear and allow the opportunity to be a growing point for everybody? That's not easy. And I'll put it in the preacher basket for a second. If someone comes to me and says, hey, and this is for Dominic Menuso whenever he sees this video, that pericope doesn't rhyme with periscope. And he's right, it doesn't. But some of us have only read words in books and haven't always heard it. I have an option. I could be upset. Like, why didn't he correct me in use of that earlier? Why didn't he say things to guide me sooner, to realize that maybe I was making improper pronunciation. It's a light matter. And I can respond back and say, I can say it any way I want. Or I can respond back and say, thanks. Glad to know that.
I saw that exchange, and what I had to do was Google what pericope is. Like, what in the world are y'all talking about? I've never heard of pericope, pericope. What are y'all talking about? Like, you guys don't even empathize with the dumb people around here. You little intellects always think everybody else knows what you're talking about. See? So honestly, I saw that whole exchange. I was like, what in the world? Like, what are we talking about?
But that's the point.
I thought somebody just left the S off. I mean, really, I didn't understand.
That's where the time, that's where the time to listen becomes opportune to grow. And I use that illustration because there's no pain involved for me or for him. I think that's an important point to kind of to grow from. And so let me add a couple things to expand the image just a little bit. When we preach, our goals intermingle with a desire to honor God, to share an understanding of the word, and to bring hearts closer to Jehovah in the ways that we can. Some of our messages do come from our hurt. What do we do with it then? And so if we're going to help individuals whose hearts are broken and work in a way to grow faith, we've got to figure out a message that accomplishes that, that has meaning. Because I don't know for you, Terry, there are times when I look back on the sermons I preached where I'm like, dude, I was not the person to share that message that day. And because I was the person who ended up speaking that day, I didn't hit my goals.
Yeah.
I didn't achieve the spiritual destination that I was aiming for because I brought my baggage on the train rather than leaving it in the confines of the world.
Let me illustrate this kind of understanding hurt and pain from my own preaching background. A couple stories. All of us preach on the family. We all preach on the home. We all preach on fatherhood. I had done that one particular year, and in the process had upset a single mother because it was a reminder to her, and she felt like to her child, who was old enough to hear the sermon and understand, a constant reminder he didn't have a dad. And that was not my intent. My first reaction to that, by the way, was, quite frankly, anger. How dare you judge me to have this evil intent that I did not have? And after time, my response was, I started thinking about how I said things, and I incorporated other thoughts into that. And I did a whole sermon on what we would classify, quote unquote, as non-traditional homes to deal with that issue that previously I had always ignored, by the way. So here was somebody who felt like they were hurt and ignored. By the way, after I preached that lesson about the more non-traditional homes, we had a great conversation, and it was appreciated that somebody heard her pain in that sense. Another issue that I had preached on in one way, and I think it's easy to do this, was about homosexuality. Because I think our traditional approach to that has been just to talk about how wrong it is and to condemn it. And all of that, what the Bible says, I am not denying. And want to make sure you understand this. But one of the last times I preached on that, I have several, let me clarify, non-practicing homosexual brethren who are faithful that I use as a sounding board to say, is this coming across in a way that's not painful? Help me understand. I think traditionally we have, in those kind of things, I think number one, I don't know about you, Phil, sometimes I'm so wrapped up in what I'm doing and who I am that I forget to think about other people. It's not intentional. I just don't consider, how does this come across? But in the process, that comes off like I'm ignoring somebody's pain. Say all that to say this. I think our greatest challenge in this is learning to see things from somebody else's perspective and understand there is pain associated with those kind of topics. I don't understand. My dad died when I was 16, so my mom was a single mom for a while, but I don't understand the divorced mom who's raising a young child. I've not been in those shoes, but I ought to be able to see there's a side of that that is painful and acknowledge that and carefully handle those situations that doesn't deepen the wound in that sense. That's part of what my work involves. So I use those stories to kind of just explain how here's some instances that I didn't think about somebody else and their pain associated with that until maybe a little bit later in my preaching life. And I don't know if you've had stories like that where somebody says something that kind of makes you realize, oh, wait a minute, this is something that maybe I should say differently in that sense. But the first step of that is learning to see other people have pain that I don't have, but acknowledging that and experiencing that. By the way, going back to Job, I think one of the things with Job is part of the reason these guys are so offensive is because there's no way for them to understand the massive grief that Job is under. And they can't, they fail to see that, and they jump into the fix-it mode, but they fail to understand the hurt that is there. So I guess what I'm saying by all that is we need to see pain in other people's life, that whether we understand it or not only see it, but then acknowledge that it is real pain.
Right.
And that's one of the things that bothers me right now is what we seem to be doing to people in some areas is they share their pain and we go, oh, no, that doesn't exist. Oh, that's not how that is, right? That's not true. We're missing a tremendous opportunity when we respond that way. And that's part of the idea.
So I kind of lay out there are times when I serve in a formal role as a mediator, moderator between folks who are upset. Either I've done so as a shepherd, I've done so as an evangelist, I've done so as a friend. And I have rules for those conversations that I follow for everybody, myself included. I make little notes to kind of keep myself on task because I'm easily distracted. But one of the things I emphasize is that our words don't always convey our meaning. It's not that we don't try, it's that communication is difficult. And our speech then becomes confused. So I encourage, and this is the goal that I have for myself, to someone who hears something, to explain it back. Now tell me what I just said. Explain to me what took place so that I can understand how well I communicated my feelings, my hurt, my ideas. And so that's one of the tools that I think is important, because we need to build an empathetic model that does accomplish that goal from the preaching standpoint, from the communicative process of taking the word in the text and explaining it to those who share a common bond or an uncommon bond, whether they be seekers of God or followers of him. So I think that's one of the things that I think is really vital to make that shift, is to adjust in that regard and say, I'm going to listen first. That text there in James 1:19, and I'm going to listen longer than I would otherwise. That leads me to another thing, which is also in this 3-step process of a text. I think there's some things that are important there. When it says slow to speak, I want to include an encouragement in that phrase, at that time phase, to ask more people more and better questions, to get the resources that you need. Terry talked about the conflict of dealing with a non-traditional home, things that he and I may have different experiences around. Well, how do we address those things? Hurt doesn't only come in that box. Dealing with abuse, dealing with leadership failure, dealing with personal failure that you didn't participate in, dealing with temptation that goes out the bounds of your experience, dealing with issues of race, dealing with issues of physical conflict. All of those have different ramifications. The very best thing you can do is acknowledge that in your strength, you don't know everything. That's a strong choice. And being slow to speak gives you that time to go, let me go ask some people who are smarter than me in these areas, more studied, more read, more experienced. What do I need to know to move to the next step? And I think from a standpoint of this is going to help, we're going to make much better decisions in that process if we make that leap of here's the next thing. And we still aren't even ready to speak yet. Like we're not even in phase 2 of the text here.
Well, and even in your conversation before you speak, you can ask questions about what was just said.
Mm-hmm.
You know, most of the time what happens is while you're speaking, I'm thinking about what I'm going to say next, and I'm not even listening to what you're saying. And I jump into things, and a lot of times it reveals, well, you weren't even listening to me, right? So listen intently, be patient, ask questions of other people, but ask questions of this person. Like, what? Okay, you said this. What did you mean by that? Right?
Yeah.
I don't understand that. I don't have that experience.
Yeah, and you can think about it this way. Think about a ridiculous, painful argument you've had where you started fighting about something absolutely not in the realm of profit. And how often you impute motive, you push motive on someone for their experiences that doesn't match the reality of the circumstances. Like you and your spouse are arguing over where to eat or what to do. And rather than back up for a second and say, look, we're both upset. We're arguing about where to eat, but we're not upset about where to eat. We're upset about this thing over here. And then you begin to insert or impute behavior of the past, feelings of whatever into this conversation that would be alleviated if you just stopped and said, wait a minute, what else is going on the inside of you? So I want to shift the text for a second. And we've talked about it in the relationship side. It's also important to be quick to hear to your own self, to understand where your feelings have shifted, and why your emotions are welling in the way that they are. We may not necessarily understand why we feel like we do, because we haven't grappled with it. We haven't positively considered it yet. And that makes a challenge for us to then step forward in a healthy way.
Yeah, we talked about in our kind of pre-show thing the stages of grief, and while not all pain brings forth grief in that sense, they are miniature kind of examples of that. One of the things, speaking from somebody who experienced some grief when my dad died at a younger age, looking back, I realized that there was a period of time where my anger, which is a natural response, my depression, which is a natural part of that response, all the things that lead up to the final kind of idea of acceptance, all caused me to think in ways about the situation that after I got to acceptance weren't the same ways. And especially during the anger phase, there was a lot of things that I was angry about that weren't even about my dad, right? I was just angry. And so there's a lot of times in that situation where if somebody had been dealing with me and they saw me angry over whatever it was, what they fail to understand if they weren't careful is the real problem was I was still dealing with the pain of losing my dad. Well, not only would they not have understood that, but I didn't understand that, I think is what I'm trying to point out. And when you talk about listening to yourself, sometimes we get really upset about something that's more surface than what the real issue is. And part of the time I've got to take the time to figure out what it is that really is causing me this pain.
Yeah.
By the way, that's not always possible, Phil, to do that by yourself either. Like, I think that's one of the things to keep in mind. That's where close friends come into play, is to help you find that.
Not even close friends, professional counselors and trained
communicators.
Absolutely. Phyllis talks about an individual personal circumstance, and I'm going to kind of extrapolate that into a larger basket. Dealing with the tensions that involve a number of factors. She's talking about family members whose sexual sins are outside the boundaries of what I understand the Bible to teach, and then how family reacts to that. There's a couple of layers that my mind immediately goes through with all those kind of issues. On the one hand, I know the statistics for why some of those outcomes take place that describe, in general terms, why someone moves in that direction. But I also have to remind myself of this truth. People are not statistics. They are not the aggregate number of 1 + 1. They are people. And so
real people with real faces and real names,
right,
and real hurt, right?
So
I think
so I can go look at it and go, all right, if I have my first model, I can say, mathematically speaking, she's likely encountered one of these 7 scenarios, and one of those 7 scenarios could have produced opportunity or tipping point for temptation to take place. And though I do not ascribe to a genetic predisposition, I do believe our environments produce our temptation box. That's a pretty easy one. But I don't know what she went through. I don't know any of those things of her on a personal level. So the only way that I'm going to understand her in a way that she's willing to understand me is to listen. I think D. Bowman has said this. I know others have said that preaching is personality when it comes to the gospel, or variations thereof it. And I want people to understand who I am as I seek to follow Jesus.
Yeah.
So that's going to require me to understand them as individuals, and it's uncomfortable at times, because listening to some things may make me deal with my own stuff, in a holistic way. So that's an important stepping stone to bring into the process, that you bring in the process of the dialogue. Yes, I'm quick to hear, to listen. Yes, I am slow to speak. But in the process of it, slow to anger is not the outcome. It is a tool that you use in conjunction with the others. And so that means I've got to be compassionate because there are others involved. Phyllis mentions that there's kids involved. Who do I want to reach? I want to reach all of them, not just the kids, not just all the broken parts of the home, all of them. And that may require me to do things that are highly uncomfortable to me in order to be an example of the gospel.
And the thing to keep in mind, that Phyllis is mentioning is, I think this is one of those areas where there's a little bit of I think our approach that needs maybe a little fine tuning. And what I mean by that is, there's, based on this story that she's sharing, there's a lot of sin involved in that. And we may be prone to latch onto one part of that story because of different factors involved, but fail to acknowledge that in that story is what's really at stake is that here's somebody whose eternity is at risk, and this is where I think helping people heal plays such an important point. How do I help in a way that also makes it possible to show them Jesus in a way that takes care of that, and what's really important, which is their soul in that sense. And I think one of the things that get lost in some of these conversations is we spend so much time arguing about this one point without realizing that this idea of a lost soul is a more important point. And before I can ever if I spend all my time arguing about this one act that they're involved in, but ignoring their soul, they don't feel like I care about helping them heal. They just think I want to argue about this one area. And that's kind of, and we're not saying, by the way, I'm not saying that I ignore that area and pretend it's okay. But what I need to do is back off of that area and address some of the other issues at play, including that area from a different perspective. And that's a different approach, I think, than what we normally have.
So, stepping through the process for me, at least, it's about understanding that words and meanings are often different. There's what I say and what I meant, and we might talk about that. Secondly, to seek out advice from those who are competent, skilled, more experienced in areas that I'm not. And always keep the biggest goal in mind. My goal is not to be right all the time, because that's not rational, not possible. My goal is not to prove that I know more, because that's also not possible nor rational. My goal is to actually have a healthy relationship with God and to bring others to have a healthy relationship with God.
Amen.
And I've got to do it in God's way. And if that's my goal, then I should change as a part of each of these conversations. Especially if I'm asking someone else to change too. I should be changed to be more empathetic and more concerned and more understanding and more insightful to an experience that wasn't my own. And it's a difficult thing, because we'll have more thing on the inside. Be quick to hear to yourself. Be slow to speak to yourself and tell you what to do. Also, it's important to be slow to be upset with yourself. Phil of yesterday is worse, I hope, than Phil of today and Phil of tomorrow. And I have regrets of things that I've said, speech that I've engaged in. I can profit from it or sink from it. And I think in this element of being a helper, I've got to craft a message that challenges someone to think in a way about moving across that same spectrum. They're yesterday, they're today's, and they're tomorrow's. And it's not always easy, but I think it's something that as evangelists, as teachers, as communicators of the King, that we've got to grapple with, across the board, especially when our value systems are different, even though they have the veneer of being the same. And Phyllis, I want to drop a couple things for you as a couple side notes. If you want to talk more about this in another format, happy to do so. And then Steve Wolfgang was with us earlier. He was watching earlier. Steve and Betty Wolfgang are folks that I always encourage people to get to know, because Steve and Betty are great at helping someone understand a set of tools to make us better communicators with ourselves and with others. I'll probably drop a link in this chat later about that particular subject. Terry?
Well, I think one of the things that we talk about James 1:19. I think one of the things that has to be brought into this as we kind of get towards the end is the issue of grace. And what I mean by that is, what I want from God more than anything else is grace. I do not want the judgment I deserve. Okay. And in all my conversations and relationships, I have a responsibility of extending grace to others. And I think one of the reasons why we so often fail to truly empathize and see other people's pain and then embrace them and try to help heal them from that is because I don't always think the best of folks. And especially when they're not like me, or when they don't agree with me on something, I don't always think the best of them. And as I said at the beginning, I think you would agree with this, Phil. I think social media has made that worse. Like, we're trained by social media that we are constantly in a us versus them dialogue, it feels like. And because of that, I don't allow this kind of merciful approach to not judge from the very beginning, right? Because what happens with me is is that I see somebody who disagrees with me and I automatically assume this is why, and I automatically assume this is where it's coming from. Now, granted, there are some times that there's a repeated behavior that may establish that long term. But as a general rule, what I want people to do for me in conversations is think the best of me and be gracious about me and not be so critical and judgmental and harsh. Well, if that's what I want, that's what I have to do for other people. And especially in some of the areas we've talked about, being gracious towards somebody who's practicing, let's say, sexual immorality, being gracious towards them doesn't mean that in the sense I'm using it, that I'm forgiving them, that I'm condoning their actions, that I'm saying it's okay. What it really means is before I jump all over them or tell them how wrong they are or judge them to be lost forever, that I want to sit down and I want to be slow to speak and quick to hear with them. I want to talk to them. I want to open up. In some of these areas, by the way, Phil, let me say, I think one of the reasons this gets really difficult for us is because there is such a polarized world we live in, even politically. Some of these things get tied into political sides of things, and we jump into that, and we really lose sight of what's important here. We can really get distracted by things that are more important if we're not careful. And I think that's just something that plays a role in all of this. And I can't help but think about when we talk about this kind of stuff. We studied First Corinthians, and I can't help but think about not just all their problems, but undoubtedly all the pain and hurt that went along with those problems, especially in that first letter, right? And then with family issues and divisions and immorality in their past and all the things we talked about. And then Second Corinthians opens up with this idea of God comforts us, you comfort each other, and there's just to me, that's a part of this conversation. God brings me in. He doesn't ignore my mistakes, but he comforts me despite those. And I have to extend that same kind of thing in these kind of conversations.
And I kind of want to summarize a couple of things, especially in context of how our emotions play into this, especially from a speaker standpoint, and then thinking in the preacher's context, but with a little personal illustration. Growing up, if you talk to my immediate family, they would probably identify me as being the youngest of all the cousins, the youngest of all the kids, as the whining crier, because that's probably how I was. From age 18 until my mom died, you could probably put a bottle on the tears that I had and find that you would not be satisfied with what was left. I mean, I just didn't cry. When my mom died, all of a sudden I started crying again. And I cry at weird times. Jill was watching the last Marvel movie and Tony Stark was dying. And she's like, "This is why you cry? You cry for this?"
Tore me up. Like, I cannot, even the second and third time I watched it, I cannot handle it. Like, dude, and I don't know about you, but you show me a movie where like there's a parent dying because of my past, and it doesn't even matter if they're like a bad parent. Like, I'm bawling over there. Like, what in the world?
Yeah. And yet I've got a pretty extroverted personality and I can share some of my emotions. We're all in different spaces in that regard. Emotions do have a big play in our message, in our intentions, in our designs, but they can still be misunderstood. Where our physical speech, not verbal speech, but our physical speech may not always match our meaning, our physical meaning. And it drives these things as an intertwining reality. A lot of surveys suggest that more than 60% of communication is nonverbal. I've seen it as high as 80% of communication is nonverbal communication. And so with all of those things, they drive our process of these three steps, if we're going to think back to this text of helping people who are hurting. We've got to be better at being quick to hear, be better listeners. We've got to be able to hold our tongue long enough so that we actually understand, and unlike Job's friends, listen to God before we speak. In the instruction that Job brings, as Job brings with the subject of suffering, God never actually answers for Job why Job suffers. He answers for us. Job suffers because of the devil. But the text begins with what some of the kids might say is a weird flex, where God says to the devil, have you considered my servant Job? He's like literally putting him out there as a sacrifice for the rest of us. And in the end, Job doesn't get the answer, even though he gets all the blessings. You and I get the answer that suffering happens sometimes because the devil, and sometimes because we're stupid. And yet we still have to learn to heal the hearts of souls that hurt. And it's a challenge for all of us, particularly when the boundaries between these things are actually further than family. Someone who comes from a different social background, a different economic background, a different demographic background than I am, means that I've got to jump through a lot of learning to empathize with them in the proper way. I might understand poverty to a degree, but not deep poverty. I might understand rebellion, but not their rebellion. I might understand being ostracized because I'm different, but I wasn't different like them. That doesn't mean that their perspective has no value. It just means it's a different one that I need to understand before I speak coherently and plainly to help.
Yeah, two things. One of those is you talk about how we're emotional. I think sometimes we're not patient with other people and allowing them to have those same emotional reactions to things. We part of empathy doesn't mean that I have the same emotional reaction to somebody. It means that I allow them to have it, and I empathize, or I care about that. Doesn't necessarily mean I have to cry when they cry. Okay. And I think that's something we confuse sometimes. The other thing that we've not talked about, and probably a good segue to the fact that we're ending soon because of time, is you got to let some of this stuff, you got to give it time to heal. It's one of the things when I get involved in some counseling sessions with married couples, it's interesting how often you do that and they want things to be fixed right after the first session, right? They want you to wave some magic wand or say some combination of words or pray some prayer that's going to fix everything. And it just doesn't work that way. And some of this takes time for people to come to their own understanding of what's causing the pain and to go through the cycle of emotional response, grief, and to they themselves be in a place where they can heal. And you just coming and hugging them and telling them that you're praying for them is not going to spur that along. And I think that's the thing that we fail to understand. Sometimes, Phil, and I don't know about you, but sometimes the response just has to be as simple as this. It's going to be okay. I'm here for you. I'll do whatever I can. I just want you to know God's got you. It's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And allowing them the time to do that. And that's where that slow to speak comes into play. I used to think that slow to speak was just waiting in that conversation before I said something. Sometimes slow to speak means you wait weeks to say something that you wanted to say weeks ago, until time has allowed enough healing to have that conversation in a fruitful way. That's the challenge I think that we have in this area.
Yeah, if someone's going to eat crow, they don't have to eat it twice.
Yeah.
That's an amorphism if you want to jump onto it later. Let me add this as a last closing thing. This isn't the closure of our dialogue on some of these issues. We're still working towards creating a couple of special additional sessions to help those who teach and preach to navigate the difficulty of communicating in challenging times, in addition to our regular Tuesday morning studies. And so once we get those squared away, we'll make some additional notes. Terry, it's good to see you as always. Any last comments for today as we go dark until I think Thursday?
Well, in this area, let me wrap up by saying this. Everybody you're around, more than likely, is hurting somehow, whether you know it or not. There's pain. They may mask it. They may hide it. But there's pain they're dealing with more times than not. You've heard people say, Phil, as I have, every pew has a hurting heart in it somewhere. And just be aware of that, and be aware that part of God's great plan for this fellowship of the kingdom is that he intends for us to help heal those hurts in whatever way we can. And so you've got to, I think that a lot of what we're talking about today is just being aware that people have genuine pain, they're hurting, and you can react in a way that helps or doesn't help. And just be cautious about that. And in the process, you'll help a hurting heart, and you'll also glorify the Lord, because you will be doing what he has asked us to do.
Yeah. So as we close out, a couple of things to remind yourselves of. In the end, our goal in all of this is to glorify God. Whether we do so from the pulpit, we do so from the pew. And to understand that the challenge of the devil is not gone away. When you have a new hire that gets brought into the instructional process of Chick-fil-A, one of the things that they teach those servers, those employees, is to learn to look, in essence, beyond the mask of the outside. And so they have a great video that they show as part of the open doors of that teaching program to see a person's story underneath the flesh of whom they are. We who preach need to do that better. We who teach need to do that better. And we who shepherd need to do that better. May God bless you today, and may God encourage you in every way that's possible. Take care, everybody.